Having established that there are two types of otaku, the type A otaku, characterized by an interest in conventional power and more masculine affinity, and the type B otaku, characterized by a lack of interest in conventional power and more feminine affinity, it is impossible to avoid the prevalence of the science fiction genre among type A works. I got into anime at the turn of the century. Sci-fi was not the face of anime to me at the time. It was a component, but it was a decisively separate thing from what I thought was the main theme of type A anime works, badassery. Type A works had a clear infatuation with the idea of a masculine force that surmounts huge obstacles and endures any trial to come out victorious. Indeed, this was the face of anime to most Western newcomers circa 2003. There is a factor to type A anime works that became especially common and pronounced in the 90s. That factor was an unconfident, obsessive fear of objective power. Perhaps the most famous illustration of this factor is the trope known as power scaling. Power scaling is something that happens in the Chojin, which means superhuman, or fighting genre, where characters become increasingly powerful as the story progresses, going from larger than life to larger than universe. The criticisms of the concept of power scaling are plentiful, but what is the most common problem with power scaling is the fact that it perfectly reflects this fear of power. You will often find characters that literally show acute symptoms of mental illness in their pursuit for power, as well as serious crises with morality and identity. But this kind of identity crisis was not limited to works that embrace power scaling. A very interesting example is Kenshin from Rurouni Kenshin, whose mental illness was actually explicitly explored in the OVA adaptation of the work, but the original work essentially glorified this mental illness and largely ignored the natural repercussions that should come from this. Another good example would be Reunite, a relatively forgotten anime from 1994. The main character, Adu, is literally a ticking time bomb. He has principles that he obsessively, almost autistically, strains himself to abide by. He has an obsessive fear of losing and failure and has a borderline mental breakdown when he does lose. But the work does not treat him as such. The work simply embodies his weakness and promotes it. Works like this were pretty much running rampant. It seems difficult to find the connection between sci-fi and the fear of power expressed through power scaling, Chojin, battling, and general badassery. But a conversation between Anno and sci-fi writer Sakio Komatsu brought the significance of sci-fi to my attention. There's an inherent Darwinistic component to science fiction. Sci-fi has always been built on this concept that science and space can produce limitless possibilities. Part of this limitlessness is a subversion of that which is sacred and that which has natural limits. The aesthetic of power in sci-fi always comes from the unknown. Gundam is a great example of this in the way that the Gundam is built from a super special material that can subvert the power balance. And then you have the new types, who are literally more evolved people. This theme manifests very interestingly in Macross, where the Zentradi acted as that unknown, powerful force. They very crudely metaphor the concept of blind power in that they are giant and don't even understand love. Macross fetishizes the concept of a pop idol because it serves as something feminine to ground the battling masculine forces and serve as a beacon of their culture and identity. This Darwinistic ideology worked just fine for the otaku for the most part, until they had started imploding on themselves somewhere in the 90s. Darwinism was the aesthetic that otaku had pursued as a weapon. That weapon was meant to allow them to challenge society, which has lost its good values, and assert their strong otaku values over the society's rotten values. Unfortunately, the Darwinistic sword turned out to be double-edged. By the 90s, things were getting strained. Seeing characters like Adu and works that supported this type of mentally ill behavior was becoming a very regular thing. And unlike in fiction, a ticking time bomb will eventually explode. The otaku were becoming frightened of the very concepts they wielded. They were valuing power over identity. Evangelion was the earthquake that triggered the tsunami of change. Evangelion was the loudest, most convincing display of a different aesthetic for the otaku. Rather than a Darwinistic relationship with otaku elements, Evangelion, not coincidentally, has a more religious relationship with its otaku elements. Rather than an emphasis on unbalanced masculinity and the concept of expanding into the unknown to draw power, Evangelion presents an aesthetic of drawing power from the familiar and feminine. The principles of protection rather than expansion are emphasized, and power is articulated as an extension of God rather than nature. Thanks to the self-cannibalizing of the Type A ideology and dominance of Evangelion, the Type B otaku became the face of anime by the O's. Part of the reason the Type A otaku reached so desperately for power is because they wanted to cure a corrupt society. This proved more difficult than imagined due to their inability to articulate who the enemy was and draw on enough confidence. The Type B otaku aggressively went against the pursuit of power that characterized the Type A. They chose to fight society through non-participation. Moe was the natural manifestation of this principle. Moe girls are the embodiment of that which is removed from society. They are non-human physically and mentally, and they naturally maintain their purity. They are by nature removed from society. An otaku can remove himself from society by expressing loyalty to these Moe girls. There has been a discussion of whether or not the otaku have become attracted to that which is dame, meaning bad or disapproved of. The otaku indeed began to shelter themselves, turn to virtual girls, and live a lifestyle that would be deemed dame. But this was their way of saying that they would not be dominated by society. Through disassociation, they expressed disapproval. There's undoubtedly a trauma in Type B otaku from the conceptual defeat of the Type A otaku. The idea of going on the offensive as the Type A otaku did has been deemed a shortcut to defeat. Instead, the otaku became infatuated with feminine powers of protection. They became obsessed with defending their identity no matter the cost. There is no safer place than inside the cockpit of the Evangelion. But what about Tokyo 3? Will it stay safe? To be continued. Jikai. Like the Type A otaku who eventually encountered fundamental weaknesses with their ideology, the Type B otaku too is now facing compounding problems. Moe is losing its original significance and anime is in a crisis. But understand why, first we must look at Moe from a deeper perspective. 君は時の涙を見る